My boyfriend opened up during a vulnerable moment and told me something about himself I wasn't ready to hear. I tried to stay calm and not judge him. He said he trusted me enough to be honest. I told him I appreciated that, but deep down I knew this was something I couldn't just accept, and everything changed after that. Hello, everyone. My name is Elena Whitmore. I'm 33, and for most of my adult life, I believed honesty was the thing that kept relationships from quietly rotting behind closed doors. Maybe I believed that because I had already been divorced. When a marriage ends, you learn that love rarely dies in one clean, dramatic moment. Sometimes it disappears under small silences, half truths, tired apologies, and conversations both people keep postponing because they already know the answer will hurt. So when I started dating again, I promised myself I would not build another relationship on pretending. That was why Adrian felt different. He was 32, divorced, and calm in a way that did not feel empty. He was not loud or flashy. He listened carefully, remembered small things, and spoke about the future like someone who had already learned how badly carelessness could damage another person. We met through a mutual friend at a small dinner. Everyone else was laughing too loudly and checking their phones between stories, but Adrian and I ended up near the kitchen island, both holding glasses of water because neither of us wanted wine that night. That detail stayed with me later. At the time, it felt like a sign. He told me he had been divorced for almost 2 years. I told him mine had been final a little over a year. We did not exchange the ugly details right away. We only shared that look divorced people sometimes recognize in each other. Not pity, recognition. Like, yes, I know what it means to survive the life you once thought would be permanent. We started seeing each other slowly, but never casually. There was intention behind it. We talked about values early. Boundaries, marriage, trust, fear, regret, what we had learned, and what we never wanted to repeat. Adrian once told me, I don't want a relationship where both people perform being easy to love. I remember smiling because it sounded mature, earnest, almost beautiful. I don't either, I said, and I meant it. For 3 months, that became the foundation between us. He met my closest friend. I met his sister. He remembered how I hated being interrupted mid-sentence, how I always drifted toward windows when I felt overwhelmed, and how I needed quiet before I could explain myself clearly. He never rushed me. He never mocked my caution. That was what made what happened later so difficult. Because Adrian was not careless with me. He was careful. And sometimes careful people still carry something dangerous. The conversation happened on a quiet night at his apartment. It had rained earlier, and the city outside his windows looked blurred and silver. We had eaten takeout noodles on the couch while a movie played in the background, but we barely watched it because the conversation kept pulling us away. At some point, the movie ended, and neither of us moved. The room was dim except for one lamp beside the sofa. Adrian sat angled toward me, one arm resting along the back cushion. He looked relaxed, but there was something heavier in his face, like a thought had been waiting for the right silence. We started talking about shame, not dramatically. It began with me admitting how cold I became during the final months of my marriage, how I used silence as punishment because I was too exhausted to explain myself anymore. Adrian listened without interrupting. Then he told me about his divorce from Claire, how bitter he became, how he begged when he should have stepped back, how he said things just to make her feel the same panic he felt. At first, it felt like the kind of conversation we had both said we wanted. Difficult, intimate, human. We were not showing each other polished versions anymore. We were opening locked doors. Then he paused. It was not a long pause, but it changed the air in the room. His eyes moved away from mine. He looked down at his hands. There's something worse, he said. I did not speak. I thought he was going to tell me he cheated, or that he had lied in the divorce, or that he had been cruel in a way he still carried guilt over. I was prepared for something painful. I was not prepared for what he actually said. During the worst part of my divorce, Adrian said quietly, I was in a fight with Claire. She told me she was leaving for good, not separating, not cooling off, leaving. His voice stayed even, but his fingers tightened. And I told her if she left me, I would kill her. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Quiet is when nothing is being said. Still is when your body forgets what to do next. I did not move away from him, but something inside me did. I looked at his face, trying to understand whether he had said it as a confession, a warning, a memory, or a test. He did not look proud. He did not look dramatic. He looked ashamed, but not shocked by his own words, and somehow that made it worse. Like he had replayed that moment as so many times that the horror had become familiar. I swallowed. Were you angry? I asked carefully. Or did you mean it? Adrian closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, he looked directly at me. I don't know, he said. Maybe I did. A little. That was the sentence that stayed. Not the threat itself, that answer. Because people say terrible things in pain. Divorce can turn grief into something ugly. I knew that. I had seen decent people become bitter, small, and cruel when they felt abandoned. But maybe I did gave me nowhere to rest. He kept talking. He told me he hated himself for saying it. That Claire looked at him like she no longer recognized him. That she left that night and never met him alone again. Every conversation after that went through lawyers, relatives, or text. I scared her, he said, and I can't undo that. His voice cracked slightly. I wanted that to comfort me. Part of it did. He was not blaming Claire. He was not blaming alcohol, pressure, heartbreak, or the divorce. He owned it in a way that sounded real. But another part of me kept circling the same thought. The feeling had existed, even if only for a second, even if he regretted it immediately, even if he had never acted on it. It had been real enough for him to admit that maybe, in that moment, part of him meant it. I stayed calm because I understood what the moment was supposed to be. He had trusted me with something ugly, something most people would bury forever. If I reacted with disgust, maybe I would prove that honesty was only safe when it was easy. So I said the words I could honestly say. Thank you for telling me. He looked relieved, but not fully, like he knew relief would be too easy. I didn't want you to find out someday and feel like I hid it, he said. I appreciate that, I said. And I did, but appreciation is not the same as peace. The conversation moved on, at least on the surface. He asked if I wanted tea. I said yes, because saying no felt too sharp. He went to the kitchen, and I sat on his couch, staring at the paused black screen of the television. My reflection looked calm. That almost scared me more, because inside I was already somewhere else. When Adrian came back, he sat a little farther from me, as if giving me space without admitting space had suddenly become necessary. We talked about lighter things, work, his sister's birthday, a book I had mentioned weeks earlier. He smiled once, and I smiled back. Anyone looking through the window would have thought nothing had changed, but I knew. A line had appeared between the Adrian I knew before that sentence and the Adrian sitting beside me now. The cruel thing was, both versions were real. The man who remembered how I liked my coffee was real. The man who once told a woman he might kill her if she left was also real, and I did not know how to hold both without cutting myself. When I left that night, Adrian walked me to my car. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still shone under the streetlights. He stood beside my door with his hands in his coat pockets. Are we okay? He asked. It was such a simple question. I could have said no. Maybe I should have. But I was not ready to turn one confession into a verdict, so I said, I just need to think. His face tightened slightly, but he nodded. Of course. Then he added, almost softly, I was afraid this would change how you saw me. I looked at him for a long moment. The honest answer was yes, but the kinder answer, the one I could manage that night, was, I'm still processing it. He accepted that. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a few seconds before starting the engine. Adrian stayed on the sidewalk, watching me with a face I could not read. As I drove home, the city lights stretched across the wet windshield in broken red and gold lines. I kept hearing his voice. Maybe I did, a little. And for the first time since meeting him, I asked myself a question I did not want to answer. What does a safe space mean when the truth someone shares makes you feel unsafe? By the time I reached my apartment, I knew something had shifted. I just did not know yet whether it was a crack we could repair, or the beginning of the end. The next few days were strange because nothing dramatic happened. No fights, no coldness, no sudden change anyone else would have noticed. Adrian still texted me good morning. He still sent me photos of ridiculous grocery store displays because he knew they made me laugh. He still called after work just to ask how my day went. And somehow that made everything harder. If he had become defensive, I could have simplified what I was feeling. If he had minimized it or accused me of overreacting, the problem would have had a clearer shape. But Adrian did none of that. He stayed exactly who he had always been. That was what unsettled me most, because now I had two truths living side by side and neither erased the other. One evening, 3 days after the confession, we met for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant near the river. The place had dim amber lights, low jazz, and tables spaced far enough apart that conversations felt private. Adrian stood when I walked in. That small gesture almost hurt. He smiled, but there was caution behind it now, not distance, awareness, like he understood something fragile existed between us and was trying not to move too quickly around it. You look tired, he said after I sat down. I laughed softly. That obvious? A little. You should see yourself. He smiled, but only briefly. The waiter came. We ordered. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I kept catching myself studying him when he looked away. The tension near his jaw. The way his thumb pressed against the side of his glass when he was thinking. The steadiness in his posture. Nothing about him looked dangerous. And yet something inside me refused to settle. At one point, Adrian reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. "You've been quieter this week," he said. I looked down at our hands. "I'm trying to figure out what I feel." He nodded, almost like he had rehearsed hearing that answer. "I understand." I looked at him then, and the sentence came out before I could soften it. "I don't think you're a bad person." His eyes stayed on mine. "But—" I hesitated because the truth sounded cruel even inside my own head. "But I can't stop thinking about the fact that you meant it, even if it was only for a moment." He leaned back slightly, not angry, hit. "I wish I could take that moment back," he said. "I know." "No, Elena, I mean it." His voice stayed low, but there was exhaustion underneath it. "I've replayed it 1,000 times. I hate that version of myself." I believed him. That was the problem. If I thought he was lying, this would have been easier. Instead, I was sitting across from a man who seemed genuinely remorseful, self-aware, and changed. And still, my body would not relax. When we left the restaurant, Adrian walked with me toward the river before we headed to our cars. The city lights trembled across the dark water. "It's okay if this changed things," he said suddenly. I looked at him. "You don't have to say that because you think it's the mature thing." "I'm not." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I told you because I didn't want to build something real while hiding the ugliest thing I've ever done." "Threatened," I corrected automatically. His eyes moved toward me. "What?" "You said the ugliest thing you've ever done." I swallowed. "You threatened her. You didn't actually do it." Adrian's expression changed. Not defensive. Haunted. "Claire didn't know that," he said quietly. The river wind moved between us, cold enough to sting. Then he added, "And honestly, I'm not sure I knew it either in that moment." That sentence followed me home, again. Not loud, not dramatic, just impossible to put down. Over the next week, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking. People survive terrible emotional states. People say horrifying things under pressure. People grow. People change. I knew that intellectually. But emotions are not built only on logic. They are built on instinct, too. And my instincts had started splitting in two directions. Part of me still felt drawn to Adrian, the man who listened when I spoke, who never mocked vulnerability, who once drove 40 minutes late at night because I casually mentioned my apartment heater had stopped working. But another part of me had started quietly imagining future arguments, not screaming fights, worse. The calm moments before people become strangers. Financial stress, betrayal, illness, loss, marriage pressure, and underneath every imagined future conflict was the same question. What happens when Adrian feels abandoned again? I hated myself for thinking that way. It felt unfair. I knew people were more than their worst moments, and I would hate being permanently defined by mine. Still, fear does not disappear, just because you can explain why it feels unfair. One Friday evening, I was at Adrian's apartment while he showered before dinner. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter beside me. I normally never looked at his screen, but this time my eyes moved before I could stop them. One name, Claire. My stomach tightened. The message preview was short. "Thank you for signing the final document. I appreciate it." That was all. No flirting, no emotional intimacy, nothing inappropriate. Still, seeing her name after everything felt like a hand pressing lightly against a bruise. Adrian came out a few minutes later, wearing a dark sweater, drying his hair with a towel. "You okay?" he asked immediately. I hated how quickly he noticed shifts in me. Claire texted. He glanced toward the counter. "Oh. You still talk?" "Only when something legal comes up." He picked up the phone without hiding it from me. There were still a few property documents getting finalized. That should have been enough, but I heard myself ask, "Does she still seem afraid of you?" The question landed heavily. Adrian lowered the phone. "I don't know," he admitted. Then, after a pause, he said, "She's polite now. Distant. Careful. I think some things don't fully leave people." He could have softened it. He could have said everything was fine. Instead, he gave me the truth again. And somehow, every honest answer pushed me farther away instead of bringing me closer. That night, while Adrian drove us to dinner, I stared out the passenger window as city lights slid across the glass. "You're doing it again," he said softly. "What?" "Leaving the room without physically leaving." I looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. I can feel it. Part of me wanted to deny it. Another part was too tired. I'm trying not to punish you for telling me. Adrian's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. That's the risk, he said after a moment. Sometimes people hear the truth and realize they can't live with it. The car became quiet after that. Not broken, just unbearably aware. And somewhere deep down, I started realizing something I had not wanted to admit. This might not be a problem we could solve. Because no matter how much I respected his honesty, I still could not silence the feeling that something fundamental had changed the moment Adrian admitted hurting someone he loved had once felt possible. And once a feeling like that enters a relationship, it never sits quietly for long. By the second week after Adrian's confession, I noticed something uncomfortable about myself. I was paying attention differently. Not obsessively, not suspicious in a dramatic searching through phones kind of way, but my mind had begun collecting details. The tone in his voice when certain topics came up, the pauses before certain answers, the names he avoided saying directly, especially hers, Claire. Before the confession, she had existed in our relationship the way most ex-wives do when people are trying to move on. A distant figure tied to paperwork, old memories, and lessons learned. After the confession, she became something else. Proof that someone who once loved Adrian had eventually become afraid of him. Once that thought rooted itself inside me, every small detail attached itself to it. One Sunday afternoon, Adrian and I were in his apartment while rain tapped against the windows. He was making coffee in the kitchen while I sat on the couch scrolling through emails. His phone buzzed on the counter. I did not mean to look, but I did. Claire again. This time, the preview read, "I'll send the storage unit key this week." It should have felt normal. Divorces take time to untangle. Shared property lingers. Legal details do not vanish just because emotions are finished. I knew that. Still, seeing her name again made their past feel less like a closed chapter and more like a door that had not fully latched. Adrian walked back in carrying 2 mugs. "You okay?" Again. Always noticing. I glanced toward the counter. "You still have things tied together?" He followed my eyes and sighed. "The storage unit. What's in it?" "Old furniture. Boxes. Random things neither of us wanted to deal with during the divorce." I nodded slowly. "Why keep it this long?" "At first because the divorce was ugly," he said, handing me the coffee. "Then because neither of us wanted to reopen communication more than necessary." That answer made sense, but it stayed with me anyway. Because people do not usually fear communication unless something happened that made distance feel safer. Adrian studied me. "You're connecting everything back to that night now, aren't you?" I looked down at my coffee. "I'm trying not to." "But you are." His voice was not accusing. That made me feel worse. "I don't know how not to," I admitted. For a second, Adrian looked tired in a way I had never seen before. "I told you because I thought honesty mattered more than hiding something ugly," he said. "But sometimes I wonder if I handed you a version of me you can't unsee." The painful thing was, he was right. I couldn't unsee it. Later that evening, Adrian left to pick up food from a restaurant nearby, while I stayed at his apartment. I told myself I was going to keep reading on the couch. Instead, I found myself staring at the bookshelf near the television. Not searching, just restless. At least that was what I told myself. I walked toward the shelf, trailing my fingers across framed photos and stacked books. Most pictures were recent. Friends, family, trips. Then I noticed one frame turned backward near the far corner. My chest tightened. I should have ignored it. Instead, I picked it up. It was an old photo of Adrian and Claire. Nothing dramatic, no wedding pose, no obvious romance. Just the 2 of them sitting on a beach years earlier, smiling at the camera with the relaxed intimacy people have before they realize they are capable of destroying each other. I stared at Claire's face longer than I meant to. She looked warm, open, safe beside him. And suddenly, against my own will, a thought entered my head. Did she ever imagine he would one day threaten her? The apartment door opened before I could stop spiraling. I quickly placed the frame back exactly where I found it. Adrian walked in carrying takeout bags and noticed immediately. What happened? Nothing. Elena. I hated that he could hear the difference instantly. I exhaled. I found the photo. His expression shifted, not panic, something sadder. Oh. You kept it. It was in a box. He set the food down carefully. I honestly forgot that one was out. I believed him, again. Always believing him made this harder. I wasn't snooping, I said. I know. He leaned against the counter and looked toward the rain-dark windows. You know the worst part? He asked. I waited. When I said those things to Claire, I thought I was the victim. The sentence hit harder than I expected, because monsters rarely describe themselves that way. Human beings do. Broken ones, angry ones, desperate ones, the kind who convince themselves their pain gives them permission to become unrecognizable for one terrible moment. I didn't touch her, Adrian continued. I never would have. But even he sounded careful saying it, not because he doubted it now, but because he knew fear does not care about technicalities once certain lines are crossed. She believed you could, I said softly. Adrian closed his eyes. Yes. That night, after dinner, Adrian fell asleep before I did. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, while city light filtered through the curtains. He looked peaceful asleep, one arm draped loosely across the bed. Slow breathing, relaxed face, completely harmless. And still, my body would not fully relax beside him anymore. That realization filled me with guilt so sharp it almost made me nauseous. Because Adrian had done everything right since telling me. He gave me space. He answered every question. He never pressured me to move on faster. And yet my body had already learned a new language around him. It no longer whispered, stay. It whispered, be careful. A few days later, I met my friend Natalie for coffee after work. I had not told anyone about Adrian's confession yet, partly because it felt personal, partly because saying it out loud would make it real. But Natalie noticed immediately. You've got that look, she said, stirring her iced coffee. What look? I'm processing something alone because saying it out loud will force me to make a decision look. I laughed despite myself. That specific? You always get quieter before you leave someone. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Natalie's expression softened. Oh no, she said carefully. What happened? For a second, I considered lying. Instead, I told her. Not every detail, just enough. Adrian's confession, the threat, his remorse, the uncertainty living inside me now. Natalie listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back slowly. That's heavy. Yeah. Do you think he'd actually hurt someone? The fact that she asked the exact question I had been silently asking myself made my chest tighten. I honestly don't know. Natalie stayed quiet for a moment. I don't think people should be defined forever by the worst thing they've ever said, she said. But I also think your body notices things before your brain gives you permission to. I looked at her. What does that mean? It means if you constantly have to explain away your discomfort in order to stay, that matters too. I hated how accurate that felt, because that was exactly what I had been doing, explaining, contextualizing, rationalizing, trying to negotiate with a feeling that refused to disappear. That night, Adrian called me while I was driving home. Hey, he said softly. Hey, you sound tired. I am. There was a pause. Do you want me to come over? The old version of me would have said yes immediately, but now I hesitated, and he heard it. That hesitation wasn't there before, he said quietly. I closed my eyes briefly at a red light. No, I admitted. Another pause. Then Adrian said, I think I'm losing you. The terrible part was, I think he already knew he was right. After Adrian said that, neither of us spoke for a few seconds. The silence between us felt too aware now, like both of us were standing in the same room but looking at different exits. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. You're not losing me, I said finally. But even to my own ears, the sentence sounded incomplete. Adrian noticed. You didn't say I was wrong. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. His honesty. The thing I had admired most about him was now dismantling us piece by piece. I don't know what I'm feeling yet, I admitted. Yes, you do, he said softly. You're just trying to decide whether feeling it makes you unfair. My throat tightened because that was exactly what had been happening inside me for days. Can I see you tomorrow? He asked. Not to convince you of anything. I just don't want this to turn into silence. That sentence stayed with me after the call ended. I don't want this to turn into silence. Maybe because silence was how my marriage died. Not through screaming, but through avoidance. Through pauses that became habits. Through conversations postponed until the damage became permanent. So the next evening, I went to Adrian's apartment. The moment he opened the door, I felt the difference between us. Not distance exactly. Awareness. Like both of us knew we were standing near the edge of something important. He stepped aside to let me in. You want tea? He asked automatically. I almost smiled. That's becoming your emergency response. A faint smile appeared on his face. I know. The softness of that moment nearly broke my resolve, because sometimes relationships end while love is still present. Adrian made tea while I stood near the windows looking out at the city below. Rain clouds covered the skyline, turning everything gray-blue and dim. When he handed me the mug, our fingers brushed briefly. The contact felt familiar and unfamiliar. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, not because either of us consciously chose distance, but because closeness had become emotionally complicated. After a while, Adrian looked at me directly. "Ask me whatever you need to ask." I stared down into my tea. "There's no magic question that fixes this." "I know," he said, "but I'd rather hear your thoughts than watch you disappear while pretending everything's okay." That hit painfully close to home, because I had been disappearing, emotionally first. "I keep trying to separate who you are now from who you were in that moment with Claire," I said. Adrian nodded once. And sometimes I can." I looked up at him. "And sometimes I can't stop imagining what kind of pain makes someone cross that line." His jaw tightened slightly, but he stayed quiet. "I know divorce destroys people," I continued. "I know grief can make people ugly. But I also know I've never threatened someone I loved." The room became very still. Adrian lowered his eyes. "You should say that," he said quietly. "You should. No defense, only shame." And somehow that made me feel worse, because it would have been easier if he acted cruel. Instead, he looked like a man already carrying punishment inside himself. "I went to therapy after the divorce," he said after a long silence. "You never told me that." "I didn't think it mattered anymore." "It does now." He nodded. "I know." Adrian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I was a wreck after Claire left," he admitted. "Not because I loved her perfectly. I didn't. But because I built my identity around being needed by her. When she stopped needing me, I didn't know who I was. I listened quietly. The night I threatened her, I wasn't thinking rationally. I felt abandoned, humiliated, terrified. And instead of accepting that pain, I wanted her trapped inside it with me." The honesty in his voice was almost unbearable because every word sounded real. "I hated myself immediately afterward," he continued. "The second I saw her face, I knew what I had done. I pictured Claire standing there, realizing the man she once trusted suddenly felt unsafe. The image made my chest ache." "I never touched her," Adrian said. "I know that doesn't erase the threat, but I need you to know I never became physically violent." "I believe you," I said softly. His eyes lifted to mine, and that's what makes this harder. For a second, he did not speak. I continued before I could lose courage. "I can understand your past without feeling safe inside it." That sentence changed his face, not because it was cruel, because it was exact. Adrian stared at the floor for several seconds. "That's because your body is trying to protect you," he said finally. I expected defensiveness, frustration, pain. Not that. "You really think that?" He looked up at me. "If my sister told me a man threatened to kill her during a divorce," he said slowly, "I wouldn't tell her to ignore the fear just because he regretted it later." I could not speak, because there it was, the truth neither of us wanted to say. Adrian understood my fear completely, and somehow that made the room feel sadder than any argument could have. "I don't want to lose you because of the worst moment of my life," he admitted. "Adrian. But I also don't want you spending years convincing yourself to feel safe when you don't." That sentence shattered something in me, because I realized he had already started accepting what I was still resisting. This relationship might not survive, not because either of us lacked maturity, not because either of us were cruel, but because some truths permanently change the emotional architecture of a relationship once they are spoken aloud. "I keep wishing there was a version of this where nobody's wrong," I said. "There is," Adrian replied softly. "Sometimes two people can both be good and still not be able to carry the same future." I looked at him, and the sadness in his voice nearly undid me, because I loved him. Maybe not fully, maybe not deeply enough for forever, but enough that losing what we had already hurt. And the cruelest part was that nothing dramatic had happened between us since the confession. No betrayal, no lies, no manipulation. Just one truth that kept widening the distance. Adrian leaned back and rubbed one hand over his face. "I was afraid to tell you," he admitted. "Not because I wanted to hide it forever, because I knew once you heard it, you might never fully relax around me again." I stayed quiet, which was answer enough. His expression tightened. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "What?" For the first time since my divorce, I felt like someone saw me as the man I became afterward, not the man I was at my lowest. His voice lowered. "And then I handed you the exact thing that might erase that." Tears burned behind my eyes, because I understood him, and because understanding him did not save us. We sat there for a long time as the city lights brightened outside. Everything around us kept moving normally, while our relationship quietly reached a place neither of us knew how to reverse. Finally, Adrian looked at me. "If you leave," he said softly, "I'll understand." That hurt more than if he had begged me to stay, because deep down I think we both knew he meant it. After that conversation, we did not officially end things, but something had already shifted into its final shape. It showed up in small ways first: the pauses before goodnight texts, the hesitation before making plans more than a few days ahead, the way both of us stopped casually mentioning the future. Before, Adrian used to say things like, "We should go there this summer," or "You'd love my family's cabin during winter." After that night, those sentences disappeared, not intentionally, instinctively, like both of us had stopped building too far ahead. A week later, he came to my apartment after work, carrying takeout and flowers. Not roses. He remembered I hated roses because they felt performative after my divorce. Instead, he brought white tulips. Simple, quiet, thoughtful. "You remembered," I said when I opened the door. "I remember most things about you." That sentence stayed with me the entire night. We ate dinner at my kitchen counter while soft music played in the background. For a while, things almost felt normal. We laughed over a ridiculous work story. He teased me for still using the same chipped coffee mug every morning. For a few dangerous moments, I let myself imagine maybe we could survive this after all. Then it happened. Not a fight, not a confession, just a moment. Adrian reached for my hand while telling me something, and without thinking, I flinched slightly before he touched me. The movement was tiny, barely visible, but he noticed. Of course he noticed. The room went quiet. My stomach dropped. "Adrian, it's okay," he said quickly, but his face had already changed, crushed. "I didn't even realize I did that," I whispered. "I know." That somehow made it worse, because my body moved before my mind had time to defend him. "I wasn't scared of you," I said quickly. His expression softened with a sadness that felt almost tender. "Elena," he said, "you don't have to protect my feelings from reality." I looked away because tears were threatening again. "I hate this." "So do I." The apartment felt unbearably still. After a while, Adrian leaned back against the counter and stared toward the windows. "You know what's strange?" he said. "What?" "If you were cruel to me right now, this would be easier." I looked at him. "At least then I could blame you instead of understanding you." That sentence broke something open in me, because I understood him too. That was the tragedy of all of it. Neither of us were villains. We were two people trapped inside a truth neither of us could outrun. "I don't think you're dangerous," I said softly, "but part of you thinks I could become dangerous." I could not answer, and silence answered for me. Adrian nodded slowly. "There it is." "I don't know how to stop feeling this," I whispered. "I know." That answer hurt almost more than anything else because he was not asking me to betray my instincts for him. A few nights later, we met for one final conversation. Neither of us called it that beforehand, but we both knew. You can feel endings before they become official. We met at a small park near my apartment just after sunset. The air was cool, and the trees moved softly above us. People walked dogs nearby. A couple laughed somewhere in the distance. Normal life continued around us, while ours quietly unraveled. Adrian sat beside me on a bench, hands folded loosely together. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled softly. "I think we're waiting for each other to say it." Tears burned immediately behind my eyes. I didn't want this to be the outcome. Neither did I. I stared ahead at the darkening park. "It feels unfair," I admitted, "because if you had lied to me, maybe I would have felt safer." Adrian gave a faint, painful smile. "Yeah, I've thought about that too." Of course he had. Adrian looked down at his hands. "Do you know what therapy taught me after the divorce?" I shook my head. "That regret doesn't erase impact. You can become a better person and still have permanently changed how someone remembers you." Claire. He was talking about Claire, but with sudden heaviness, I realized maybe one day he would think about me that way too. Another woman who walked away carrying a version of him he wished never existed. "I wanted this to work," he admitted, "more than I expected." I looked at him then, really looked at him. At the exhaustion beneath his eyes, at the restraint in his posture, at the sadness he was trying not to let turn into anger. And the terrible thing was, I trusted that sadness. I trusted his remorse. I trusted the work he had done. But trust is complicated. Sometimes you can trust someone's intentions and still not trust the emotional risk your body feels around them. Adrian reached toward me instinctively, then stopped himself halfway. That hurt more than if he had touched me, Because he noticed. Because he was trying not to become the thing I feared. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking for the first time since I met him. "I would never hurt you." I believed him, completely. And still, I whispered, "I believe you. That's what makes this harder." He closed his eyes. I continued, my voice shaking now. "But I don't want to spend years convincing myself not to be afraid of the possibility." When Adrian opened his eyes again, he looked unbearably tired. "Then we shouldn't keep doing this," he said. The sentence landed softly. No anger, no manipulation, no guilt, just clarity. I started crying harder because some part of me still wanted one of us to find the sentence that would save everything. But there wasn't one. Love was here. Respect was here. Even tenderness was here. And somehow, it still was not enough. Adrian looked at me for a long moment. "Are you leaving because of who I am now?" he asked. "Or because of who I was then?" The question shattered me because the answer was both, and neither. "I think I'm leaving," I said, wiping at my face, "because I can't build forever on a fear I have to keep explaining away." Adrian lowered his head. Then he nodded. Not because it did not hurt, because he understood, and honestly, that almost made the ending worse. Adrian walked me home after that. Not because either of us needed help, but because neither of us was ready for the final goodbye. The streets were quiet, washed in pale gold light from storefronts and passing cars. Wind moved softly through the trees while the city carried on, completely unaware that something important was ending between two people walking side by side. We did not hold hands. That felt too intimate now. But every few steps, I became painfully aware of how naturally we still matched each other's pace, like our bodies had learned each other, even while our future was falling apart. When we reached my apartment building, we stopped near the entrance. I looked up at him. God, he looked tired. Not resentful, just emotionally worn down in the way people look after accepting something they spent weeks trying not to lose. "I'm glad you told me," I said. Adrian smiled faintly, though sadness stayed in his eyes. "Even now?" I nodded. Yes, and I meant it. I did not regret his honesty. I regretted what it revealed. Adrian looked down briefly. "There's a version of this where I never tell you," he admitted. "Maybe we stay happy longer." The sentence sat heavily between us, because he was right. Maybe we would have lasted another year, maybe longer. Maybe I would have fallen fully in love with him before ever learning the ugliest moment of his life. Maybe ignorance would have felt safer, but eventually I shook my head. "No," I said. "I think it would have surfaced somehow." Adrian gave a tired half-smile. "Probably." Then silence settled between us again. Final this time. Adrian stepped a little closer, then stopped himself again, still careful about my space even now. That restraint nearly broke my heart. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For giving you something you can't unknow." Tears burned behind my eyes. "You didn't force me to leave." "No," he said. "But I understand why you are." I stared at him. I wish understanding made this easier. Me too. For one impossible second, I wanted to ignore every instinct inside me and ask him to stay, because love was still here, because tenderness was still here, because he had never once tried to shame me for feeling what I felt. But deep down, I knew what would happen if I stayed. Every future argument would carry an invisible shadow. Every moment of anger would remind me of that confession. And no relationship survives when one person is constantly negotiating with fear behind the scenes. So instead, I stepped forward and hugged him. The moment my arms wrapped around him, Adrian exhaled shakily against my shoulder, like he had been holding his breath for days. He hugged me gently, almost gently enough to avoid hurting something already broken. That hurt most of all. Because nothing about him in that moment felt unsafe. He just felt sad. When we pulled apart, his eyes were red too. "I really did love you," he said. The word "did" landed heavily, past tense already. "I know," I whispered. He nodded once, then stepped back. No dramatic final kiss, no begging, no promises to wait, just two exhausted people accepting reality. "Goodbye, Elena." "Goodbye, Adrian." And then he walked away. I stood there long after he disappeared down the sidewalk, partly because I was crying, partly because I knew I had just walked away from someone who, in many ways, had been good to me. That was the part outsiders probably would not understand. This was not a story about escaping a monster. It was a story about realizing love and safety are not always the same thing. Over the next week, everything settled quietly. No angry texts, no guilt, no attempts to pull me back. Adrian respected the ending exactly the way he had respected every difficult conversation after the confession, and somehow that made grieving him harder. A few days later, I found myself replaying our relationship from the beginning. The dinners, the late-night conversations, the way he noticed when my mood shifted before I even spoke, the warmth, the care, the effort. Looking back, I realized Adrian had given me something many people never receive before commitment becomes irreversible. The full truth, painful truth, relationship-ending truth, but truth nonetheless. Natalie came over one evening with takeout after realizing I had been ignoring most of her messages. She sat beside me on the couch while I turned an untouched wine glass between my fingers. "Do you regret it?" she asked carefully. "Leaving him." That was what she meant. I thought about the question for a long time. "No," I said, "but I'm sad about it." Natalie nodded. "That sounds healthy, actually." I laughed weakly. "It doesn't feel healthy." It rarely does. We sat quietly for a moment before she spoke again. "A lot of people would have stayed just because he seemed remorseful. I know. But remorse and compatibility aren't the same thing." That sentence stayed with me because it explained what I had been trying to say from the beginning. Adrian was remorseful. I believed his growth was real. I believed he never wanted to become that person again. But relationships are not built only on logic and forgiveness. They are built on the quiet trust your body feels before your mind has to argue for it. And mine no longer did. Weeks later, I still thought about him sometimes, usually late at night when the city became quiet enough for memories to feel louder. I wondered if he was okay. I wondered if he blamed himself for telling me. I wondered whether part of him wished he had hidden that truth forever. Maybe part of me wished that too. But only temporarily, because eventually I understood something clearly. A safe space does not mean every truth shared. Inside it must be accepted without consequence. Sometimes honesty brings people closer. Sometimes it reveals a fracture love cannot repair. Neither outcome automatically makes someone evil, and neither outcome means the relationship was meaningless. Adrian was not a monster. I was not cruel for leaving. We were simply two people who learned something important too early to ignore and too late to undo. And maybe that is the hardest kind of ending there is. Not explosive, not hateful, just the kind of ending that hurts because nobody lied.